Apple is finally restoring balance to its portable lineup with the new 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro. If you really wanted a big screen Mac to do video editing and things like that, over the past year you've been stuck with outdated Intel and AMD hardware on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So really we've been waiting a long time for an M1 update for that computer. If you'll remember 2 years ago when I reviewed it, I called it the best Apple laptop ever. So yeah, it's about time we've got something better. And it's worth remembering, for all the hype around the M1 chip last year, that thing was really geared towards mainstream consumers. Creative professionals, they were kind of let down by it. That chip couldn't really handle heavy-duty audio and video editing, and it was also capped at 16 gigabytes of RAM. So if you're actually dealing with big media files, you're definitely going to need more than that. Apple's redesigned MacBook Pros are exactly what creative professionals have been waiting for. They're far faster than last year's M1 chip, they support up to 64 gigabytes of RAM, and they borrow a lot of the technology from the iPad Pro's XDR displays. So overall, these are really strong packages. Apple also looked backwards a bit as it stepped forwards, and it brought back some older ports that a lot of people have wanted, and it also went back to design that's more reminiscent of some of its older computers. Just call them the PowerBooks Reborn. The 14-inch MacBook Pro is probably the most interesting one of this new lineup because Apple isn't really trying to replace the 13-inch model. That one is still around, it's still going to be selling for $1,300 to start. But the 14-inch is basically a shrunken down version of the 16-inch laptop. You know, they can do exactly the same things. They both can run the M1 Max chip. They can, both support up to 64 gigabytes of RAM. The only difference is the high power mode, which is something that'll let the 16-inch with the M1 Max chip just get a little bit of a speed boost in certain situations. Overall though, the capabilities of the 14-inch model is really what let me come to terms with its high $1999 starting price. The 16-inch MacBook Pro starts at $2499, which is $100 more than the old Intel model. Both notebooks still look like MacBook Pros. They've still got, unibody aluminum cases, but overall you'll notice they're a little different. They're a little more bulbous and a little more thick. The edges more resemble the old PowerBooks and, the laptops we were seeing from Apple throughout the 2000s. They're also a bit heavier than you'd expect. The 14-inch model clocks in at 3.5 pounds, while the 16-inch goes between 4.7 and 4.8 pounds, depending on the type of CPU you get. That's about a half pound heavier than the old 16-inch laptop. All of that heft makes the MacBook Pros more functional though. It allowed Apple to cram in more ports, including 3 Thunderbolt 4 USB-C connections, a full-size HDMI port, a MagSafe power connection, a high-impedance headphone jack, and an SD card reader. Personally, I'm just thrilled about the SD card reader coming back. And sure, you'll still need some adapters to plug in your old USB Type-A devices, but hey, at least you won't need something special just to offload video or photos or something. You can still charge up these computers over USB-C, which is a nice feature to have in a pinch, but I still prefer the MagSafe connection. First of all, that breakaway is just really nice because it means if somebody trips on it, they don't send your laptop crashing, and it's nice not to just take up a very valuable USB-C port just for power. Looking at the MacBook Pro screens makes it clear they're anything but retro though. They feature 14.2-inch and 16.2-inch Liquid Retina XDR displays, respectively. Mini LED backlighting lets them reach up to 1600 nits of peak brightness, which is great for HDR content. The screens are a sharp 254 pixels per inch, with a 3024 by 1964 resolution on the 14-inch and a 3456 by 2234 resolution on the 16-inch. Neither are true 4K, the 16-inch comes pretty close, but you'll still be able to work on 4K and 8K content at a reduced scale. Best of all, both of these MacBook Pros also support ProMotion, which is Apple's technology that enables refresh rates up to 120 Hz. With that enabled, scrolling through web pages and documents just looked a lot smoother. I really noticed that while working on this review because my eyes aren't struggling to keep up with a 60 Hz display. There's just less jitter, and that's something I also noticed on the Surface Laptop Studio. So Microsoft technically beat Apple to the punch here in bringing this technology to laptops, but it's still nice to see, and Apple, I guess, is first because it was on the iPad Pro. ProMotion is also intelligent enough to lower the refresh rate if you're staring at a static image or just doing something that doesn't require a lot of fast motion. So that's really going to help with battery life. Really though, you probably don't have to think too much about any of the technology involved. Just know that Apple's Liquid Retina XDR displays look incredible. HDR content looks eye-wateringly bright when you're looking at really peak scenes, and you've got some inky dark blacks too for dark scenes. And what's nice about HDR is it can kind of manage both of those at the same time. These aren't OLED screens, but mini LED technology definitely makes these laptops look almost as good as OLED. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the notch in the middle of the screen. Just like the last few iPhones, Apple carved out a space at the top of the screen to fit in a webcam, and specifically this is a 1080 webcam, which is a nice bump from the old 720p models. At first glance, it's honestly laughable that Apple is leaning into the notch, something people are just still making fun of on the iPhones, but after using these computers for a while, I didn't find them to be a big deal. The big reason why is that the notch is up at the top of the screen, which you're never really going to use for content. Apple wisely pushed the menu bar up around the notch, so your file and system menu and all that fun stuff are still up there as usual. You're never actually using the middle of the screen for anything, so you're not actually losing much. Apps also black out the notch entirely when you go full screen, or you could use a black wallpaper and just kind of hide it. It's a nice effect, especially when you're going full screen, and it doesn't feel like I am losing screen real estate, which I think is the big argument a lot of people have had with this thing. And honestly, I'd happily give up a slight bit of screen space if it means fitting in a better camera, because yeah, we've just been cursed with terrible Apple webcams for the past 10 years. At best, they were 720p. These new cameras look fantastic. I've done a ton of video calls, and I could clearly see that, everything just looked sharper and more colorful, and there was just more detail to the image. And yes, it's better than the webcam on the M1 MacBook Air, which was updated but still stuck at 720p. It's just nice to see. It's nice to have a Mac without an awful camera. Still, it would have been nice to see Face ID built into these Macs, especially since Windows Hello has been on Windows PCs for so long, and it really does make logging in and authenticating yourself so much easier. Okay, so enough table setting. How do these things actually perform? Our 14-inch review model was equipped with an M1 Pro sporting 16 GPU cores, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and a 1 terabyte SSD. The 60-inch had the 32 GPU core M1 Max, a 2 terabyte SSD, and a whopping 64 gigabytes of RAM. This, by the way, marks the first time I've reviewed a laptop with that much RAM. Both of Apple's new chips also feature 10 CPU cores. For comparison, the M1 had just 8 CPU cores and a maximum of 8 GPU cores. Now, just based on these specs, I expected some wild performance, and the benchmarks didn't disappoint. According to Geekbench 5, the MacBook Pros blew away every Windows PC we reviewed this year by a significant margin. That includes the NUC 11 Extreme, powered by Intel's Core i9 11900KB, a high-end desktop CPU. The single-core performance on the M1 Pro and Max was similar to the M1, which is unsurprising, but the multi-core figures were far higher. The Geekbench 5 compute score, which is really GPU heavy, made it clear that Apple still hasn't surpassed AMD and Nvidia though, so there's still a lot of competition going on there. The 14-inch MacBook Pro was more than twice as fast as the Surface Pro 8, running Intel's Xe graphics, and the M1-equipped 13-inch MacBook Pro, while the bigger notebook was on par with the Surface Laptop Studio, equipped with an NVIDIA 3050 Ti. These aren't bad scores by any means, but if you really need heavy GPU power for 3D rendering or lots of video editing, then you probably need a Windows PC with a dedicated graphics card. For the most part though, I don't really think those extreme data users are the type of people Apple is aiming for with these laptops. I really think they're going after the video and audio producers that really used to rely on Mac hardware over the last few decades. Apple's new chips will certainly be more than enough for dealing with media. Both computers managed to convert a 4K video clip to 1080p in 34 seconds with Apple's Video Toolbox hardware encoder, which is 4 seconds slower than the NUC 11 Extreme, but 4 seconds faster than the XPS 15. They were also among the fastest Cinebench R23 performers we saw this year. Only the Asus ROG Strix G15 gaming laptop bested them. Surprisingly enough, I didn't notice a huge difference in benchmark scores when I was running them off of battery too, which is something Apple's really leaning on here. That's really useful because if you're stuck somewhere just working off of battery, you can still encode some video, do some 3D stuff, and still get the full power of your computer. And once again, the efficiency of the M1 chip's ARM design leads to pretty great battery performance. The 14-inch MacBook Pro lasted 12 hours and 35 minutes in our benchmark, while the 60-inch went for 16 hours and 34 minutes. That's over 5 hours longer than the last model we reviewed. It's clear that Apple has just been listening to all the complaints that Mac users and maybe some of us lowly reviewers have been making over the last few years. But really, that's something the company has been doing more of recently, like when they moved away from those awful butterfly keyboards towards the Magic Keyboard. And that makes a return here on both of these models. It still feels fantastic. It is wonderful to type on. There's some great tactility and responsiveness and feedback that almost feels like a mechanical keyboard. So I love typing on these things. I hope Apple never moves away from this. And of course, the touchpad is still great too. I think Apple has pretty much perfected that in notebooks over the last decade, and nothing much has changed, but nothing really needed to. Apple didn't really skimp on audio either. Both of these computers have a 6-speaker array with 2 tweeters and 4 force-canceling woofers. And overall, they just sound fantastic and honestly a little miraculous. I normally just play a couple music tracks on the laptop to make sure the speakers sound awful, because they always do, but these sound great. It's sort of like you're listening to 2 small bookshelf speakers just sitting right in front of you. So it's more than enough to have like a personal jam session, and I just really enjoyed it. I hope Apple sticks with this design and maybe brings some of this down to the MacBook Air eventually. The 16-inch MacBook Pro does sound a little better just because of physics. There's more room to plug in bigger tweeters and bigger speaker drivers and whatnot. So if you really care about sound, that may be something to lean on. The microphones built into these computers are also pretty impressive, especially during video calls. When I was talking to other people using these MacBook Pros, they sounded great. They sounded like they had a USB microphone in front of them. So that's something I hope Apple also brings to other computers. I don't think you'll be able to record a music session with these like Apple thinks you will, but if you're on the go or you want to record a podcast and you're somewhere remote, they'll probably be more than enough. So wrapping up, if you're in the market for one of these new computers, which one should you get? I lean towards the 14-inch just when it comes to general computing and productivity tasks. I think in particular the 14-inch is going to be really good for programmers and coders who maybe don't need a ton of real estate but want all that power. When I've talked to audio and video producers though, all they want to do is go big. They want to see big timelines, they want to do all their projects anywhere, so I think that makes sense. I think the big takeaway is just think about your own use case and how much you're willing to lug around a laptop that's nearly 5 pounds just for a bigger screen. The biggest downside of these new computers are their high prices, but really, what did you expect from Apple? The 14-inch model in particular will probably give you the vapors if you're comparing it directly to the 13-inch, which starts at $1299. The 14-inch at $1999 is just a lot more, but as we've explained, it does a lot more too. The Razer Blade 14 is just a few $100s less than the MacBook Pro 14-inch, and on the bigger front, the XPS 15 is about $500 less than the MacBook Pro 16-inch for a comparable spec. But once you start adding in a faster CPU and maybe more RAM, those prices also start to equalize. So these computers are really just meant for people who want to spend a lot of money to do their work faster, because ultimately that's more valuable to them. Basically, if you're a creative professional with a large budget for a new computer and you want something that's genuinely going to speed up your workflow, these new MacBook Pros are exactly what you've been waiting for. Stay tuned to Engadget.com for more of our Apple laptop reviews and really all of our laptop reviews. If you dug this video, be sure to like and subscribe.